Good morning, everyone. I'm Stuart Pettis from the AFA's STEM Education Office. I'm also a member of the Space Working Group. It is my distinct pleasure this morning to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Kenny Grosselin from the Chief of Space Operations Strategic Initiatives Group to present a Space Force 101 briefing to AFA members. In this job, Colonel Grosselin oversees the CSO's speeches, testimony, and planned engagements. He is a graduate of the United States Air Force Weapons School as well as the Academy, and is one of the principal authors of the Space Force's Capstone Doctrine. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Grosselin.
Thank you, Colonel Pettis, and it's a pleasure to be here. The Space Force benefits tremendously from AFA. We're such a young service that there's large portions of the country that don't have a solid understanding of what we do or who we are. And that's where the AFA network of chapters comes in. You guys can be the advocates for us in the local community, helping those populations understand the Space Force, our mission, and the operational requirements that we bring to the country. So thank you. The brief I'm going to give here today is Space Force 101. It's derived from a brief that we give to inter-service transfers that join the Space Force from the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, or the Marine Corps. The brief is about 35 to 40 minutes long, and afterwards there'll be a Q&A session. If you do have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then I'll answer those questions at the end of the brief. We'll start off with why we have a Space Force, and this first slide is really the center slide. If you can take any slide away from this brief, it's this one. It has the mission, the core values, and the motto of the Space Force. The mission statement of the Space Force is to secure our nation's interests in, from, and to space, and we'll pick apart that mission statement across the brief and talk about which each part meets. To do that, we're comprised of guardians. That's the term for someone in the Space Force, both officer, enlisted, and civilians as well. And we share 4 core values: character, connection, commitment, and courage. The motto of the Space Force is Semper Supra, and it's a testament to the fact that any service, wherever they go, anywhere in the world, they always have space capabilities above them, supporting them with what they need. And so the first part of the Space Force mission statement is to secure our nation's interest. And so in order to understand what the Space Force does, you have to understand what the Space Force, what interests we secure for the nation. And those interests range from peacetime activities all the way through conflict. In peacetime, the space capabilities, both commercial space capabilities and DoD space capabilities, are instrumental to agriculture and telecommunications and global transportation, network banking, finance. And those are really the day-to-day activities that everyone in the United States relies on space for. GPS is a Space Force capability that is made available to the public. Communication satellites, usually commercial, are part of our global communication infrastructure as well. But as we shift towards the military aspect of what the Space Force provides, the real reason that the Space Force is there, the entire joint force has been designed under the assumption that forces around the world will have access to space capabilities, that they'll have access to global space communication, they'll have access to GPS, access to weather data, missile warning data, and that really spans the spectrum of conflict all the way from day-to-day competition in every AOR up through the high-intensity conflict. Now, the history of space operations within the military goes back really to 1947 with the establishment of the Space Force, the establishment of the Air Force. Shortly after the Air Force was established, the RAND Corporation did a study on the feasibility of an Earth-orbiting satellite for military missions. All of that culminated in 1958 with the Explorer 1 launch, which was the first U.S. satellite, a couple months after the Sputnik launch. In 1960, you had the first Corona images that were captured. These were images of the Soviet Union taken by a satellite, and then the film canisters were returned to Earth. And then in 1965, there was a space directorate established on the Air Force. And this is really when the Air Force's role in space operations started to accelerate. In 1982, you had the establishment of Air Force Space Command. That organization became the foundation of the Space Force in 2019. But in between that, you had the first space war, 1991, the Gulf War, where GPS was used for the famous right hook through the desert. And then you had communication satellites. GPS-aided munitions followed shortly after the Gulf War. And then you had a long development where space went from being a strategic level support capability to a tactically integrated into every domain. And then obviously in 2019, you had the establishment of the Space Force. The big threat that was driving this was, the change of the space domain. And so there's really two ways that we talk about how space has changed going back to 2008. The first one is that it's become more contested. And when we talk about the congested space domain, we're really talking about how many objects are in space, the amount of activity that's in space. And so if you look at the number of objects that are tracked today, and you compare it to the number that were tracked in 2008, that number has increased by 383%. The number of active satellites on orbit has increased by 473% since 2008. The number of worldwide launches in a given year, if you compare 2022 to 2008, it's increased by 267%. The number of satellites launched has increased by 2,100%. And then, all of those are just numbers, but what we really want to look is, how crowded has the space domain become? And if you look at the number of conjunctions, the number of forecasted collisions where the ISS, there was a potential that it could collide with another object, that number has increased by 1,100% since 2008. And so the space domain has become much more congested over that time. And it's not just military satellites. In fact, most of these increases are driven by commercial applications within the space domain, but that still creates a more crowded domain that we have to operate in. From a threat perspective, there's also been a large increase in threats in the space domain. We talk about in 2007 was when China destroyed one of their own weather satellites with a direct ascent anti-satellite missile. But the spectrum of threats is much more diverse and sophisticated than just a single type of weapon. One of the threats that we are the most worried about in the Space Force today is cyber attacks. Our space systems have these global footprints that are connected by these very complicated networks, and those networks are vulnerable, like any network is, to cyber attack. And so you have to secure the networks. There's also a vulnerability for electronic warfare. Every satellite has to communicate down to the Earth through an RF link, and that link, like any other link, can be jammed. It can be spoofed. It can be disrupted through different measures. There's also directed energy weapons. Russia deployed their first 5 systems in 2018. Directed energy is basically a laser that can be used to dazzle or damage a sensor on a satellite that's used to collect mission data. And then recently, over the last couple of years, we've seen both the Russians and the Chinese experiment with space-to-space threats. These are satellites that are designed to go out and create effects against other satellites to prevent them from doing their mission. The most recent one was the 2022 tests of a grappler satellite by the Chinese, the SJ-21. The Russians have done similar tests in low Earth orbit. And then, of course, the ground systems themselves are always vulnerable to a physical attack. And so you have this spectrum of threats from reversible to non-reversible. They can be against the satellites in orbit, the ground stations on the Earth, or the RF links in between. And this is really one of the motivating drivers behind the Space Force. is protecting the satellites that provide the benefits to U.S. security and prosperity against this spectrum of threats. Now, how is the Space Force going to do this? What's our approach to countering all of these threats? That's where these three tenets come in. And this is the Space Force we're trying to build can do these three things. First, the Space Force can avoid operational surprise within the space domain. When you try to understand what's happening in the space domain, the orbital mechanics of a satellite's orbit makes it difficult to track an object 24/7, 365. Because every satellite is circling the Earth, it'll spend some time over the northern hemisphere, sometime over the southern hemisphere, sometime over the eastern hemisphere, sometime over the western hemisphere. And so that means you need a global network of sensors to track those objects and identify any threats that arise. And that's what avoiding operational surprise is about. Space is a large area of responsibility. It's by far the largest for all the combatant commands. And so tracking those objects, identifying what are threats and what are not, is a 24/7 mission. And that's really where we make sure that we understand what our adversaries are doing and that they don't gain the upper hand against U.S. interests. The second area that we have to do to protect against these threats is to deny first mover advantage. The way that satellites operate is they're very vulnerable to attack. They've been designed that way over 30 years as we've tried to get the most capability out of those satellites. We've tried to make them as cost effective as possible. And so the architectures we have were vulnerable to attack. So what the Space Force is trying to do is move away from these architectures that consolidate lots of warfighting capability in single satellites and proliferate them so that we're not susceptible to a single attack that knocks out coverage across a large swath of the Earth. And then the third piece is all of these benefits that we derive from space, our adversaries derive those same benefits as well. Both Russia and China have extensive networks of satellites that allow them to target forces around the globe. The Space Force has to find a way to deny those capabilities without making the space domain unusable for U.S. interests in space. And that's where responsible counter-space campaigning comes in. Really what this is about is protecting the joint force from space-enabled attack. So that's a big overview of what the Space Force mission is and how it sees its approach to that. In terms of what we do, within the Space Force mission statement, we talked about securing the nation's interest in space, from space, and to space. And those three prepositions are the core functions of the Space Force. These are the things that we bring to the joint force that they rely on the Space Force to provide. So the first core function is space superiority. This is the equivalent of air superiority in the Air Force. That is defending against space and counter space threats. All right, so this is this idea that in order to use space capabilities, you first have to be able to protect those space capabilities, and you also have to make sure that forces in all the other domains are protected from space-enabled attack. Now, that's the space superiority mission or core function. And then the mission areas that fall underneath that are orbital warfare, electromagnetic warfare, and space battle management. The second core function is global mission operations. This is can exploit the domain on behalf of the joint force. So the Space Force enables the joint warfighting functions to occur in every domain and every AOR on a global scale. So when we say global mission operations, it's the ability to integrate fires, movement and maneuver, protection, sustainment, command and control, intelligence, and information on behalf of the joint force on a global scale. These are mission areas like missile warning and satellite communication and positioning, navigation, and timing data. And then the third core function is assured space access. It's the ability to access the domain, deploy equipment into the domain, and sustain operating from the domain. This is launch, range control, and then satellite control network activities. So when we talk about, why we have a Space Force, that's really the mission statement of the Space Force: secure the nation's interest in, from, and to space. When we talk about what the Space Force does, those are the core functions: space superiority, global mission operations, and assured space access. The who, these are what people in the Space Force do. These are the space power disciplines. Orbital warfare is commanding and controlling satellites and then protecting those satellites from attack. When we talk about space battle management, that is taking all of the global sensors that allow us to track satellites in orbit and then synthesizing that data into an understanding of what's happening in space, and then directing forces so that they have the data that they need to do their mission. The third space power discipline is electromagnetic warfare. Everything we do in space operations depends on the electromagnetic spectrum. There are no hard lines tethering satellites to the surface of the Earth. We communicate with those satellites through the RF spectrum. That means that we are vulnerable to attack in the spectrum itself. And so we have to protect that spectrum so that we can use it for our satellites. And if needed, we can also deny a rival or an adversary access to parts of the spectrum in order to prevent them from using their satellites. We also have engineers and acquirers in the Space Force who have an ops expertise and then take that ops expertise and inform the systems that we buy, the programs that we manage, and the sustainment of our space capabilities. The next discipline is space access and sustainment. This is the discipline that looks at launching satellites into orbit and then sustaining that equipment through the satellite control network that allows us to talk to our satellites, or recovery operations for some of the launch capabilities that return to Earth. And then, like any other military service, we need intelligence experts. That's the military intelligence space power discipline. And then cyber operations is the last one. Just as everything we do is reliant on the RF spectrum, everything we do relies on a global network of systems and capabilities that are vulnerable to attack. And the cyber operations discipline is those guardians that protect our networks from that attack. So across these disciplines, you have officer and enlisted expertise. Engineering and acquisitions is mostly officer within the Space Force. However, the contracting support and the finance support that we rely on for those expertise, that is within the Air Force, but there is enlisted expertise within there. So this is how the Space Force is organized. Just like every other service, we have a headquarters element in the Pentagon, just like the Air Staff is in the Pentagon. The Space Staff is in the Pentagon as well. And then our field units are divided into field commands. And so this is the equivalent of a major command in the Air Force. In the Space Force, we call them field commands. We have 3 primary service field commands. This is Space Operations Command, which is the forces command for the U.S. Space Force. So all the operational forces are in SPOC. And then we have Space Systems Command, which is the acquisition and sustainment command for the Space Force. That's headquartered at LA Air Force Base. And then we have Space Training and Readiness Command, STARCOM, which is the test, training, and education command for the Space Force. Those 3 field commands make up the predominance of service forces. However, like every service, we also present forces to the combatant commands through a component field commands. And so when a unit in SPOC is presented to a unit in Indo-PACOM, that unit is presented through U.S. Space Force's Indo-Pacific, which is a component field comm to Indo-PACOM. Similarly, we have a component field comm for U.S. Space Force for Central Command. That's U.S. Space Forces Central. And then today, Spock is dual-hatted as the component field comm to U.S. Space Command. We are in the process of establishing a component field comm to U.S. Space Command to give them a dedicated commander for their operational forces. That'll be U.S. Space Forces Space. The establishment of that field comm is ongoing, hopefully in the next 12 months. And then in December, we'll establish a component field comm assigned to EUCOM. That'll be U.S. Space Forces Europe and AFRICOM. So it'll be assigned to EUCOM, and then it'll also be the headquarters element for AFRICOM. And then finally, a big part of the Space Force is actually detailed to the NRO. The NRO is not part of the Space Force. However, there are Space Force members, guardians, detailed to the NRO. Those guardians are organized into the Space Force element, which provides the chain of custody back to the Department of the Air Force for the administration of those guardians who are in the NRO who help support that mission. In terms of a hierarchy, when the Space Force was established, they removed 2 levels of command. So is where the Air Force has a major command, a numbered Air Force, a wing, a group, and a squadron. The Air Force or the Space Force took out the numbered Air Force echelon of command and then the group level of command. So you have a squadron, which reports to a delta, which reports to a field comm. So we are a very flat military service when you compare us to the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marines, and that we don't have the same number of echelons of command. And that was part of how the Space Force was designed, to be an agile service that you could very quickly move things through the staffing process, and you weren't burdened by multiple levels of command to do that mission. The Space Force also has 2 direct report units that are critically important to our mission. The first is the Space Rapid Capabilities Office, which is an acquisition organization that is designed to buy things quickly with special acquisition authorities. And then we have the Space Development Agency, which is it's another acquisition organization, and they're building out the proliferated space warfighting architecture. But where the Space Force is, and like I said in my intro, this is really where the AFA chapters become so important. Right now, we have guardians at 46 bases and installations in 18 states and territories. And that's a lot. It's a much bigger footprint than when it was an Air Force mission under Air Force Space Command. However, that's still a relatively small footprint when you look at the number of states and the number of communities that don't have an Air Force presence. And that's where we rely on AFA and that national network of chapters to help be our advocates within the local communities and explain what the Space Force does, who we are, what we do. The 3 main service field commands, today 2 of them are headquartered in Colorado Springs. In the future, STARCOM will look to move to Patrick. And then the Space Systems Command is headquartered at Los Angeles Air Force Base. We have deltas across the command, and we also have some locations overseas in Greenland, and then Ramstein Air Base hosts the detachment that will eventually become U.S. Space Forces URAF. And then we have an organization in Korea that is a component to U.S. Forces Korea. That's U.S. Space Forces Korea, which is subordinate to U.S. Space Forces Indo-Pacific. So I talked about where the guardians are. This next slide talks about where the satellites operate. And so there's really 4 main orbital regimes where we operate satellites. The first is low Earth orbit. This is the volume of space that's between 100 kilometers and 2,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. Most of the satellites within this regime are sensing satellites that's very close to the Earth, and so it's easy to sense things that are happening on the Earth. But you also have a smaller footprint because the closer you are to the Earth, the smaller the surface of the Earth that you can observe at any one time. The second orbital regime is medium Earth orbit. This is where the constellation of GPS satellites are located. Technically, medium Earth orbit is defined as anything between 2,000 kilometers and about 35,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. But it's really the volume of space right around 20,000 kilometers, which is where the GPS satellites are at. And then the third orbital regime where we have Space Force assets operating is geosynchronous Earth orbit. These are satellites that are about 35,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. Once you reach that altitude, the amount of time it takes to orbit the Earth is about the same amount of time as it takes the Earth to rotate on its axis. So what that means is that an observer on the surface of the Earth will view a satellite in the same location at any time. And so it's relatively easy to find the same satellite because you know where it's at in the sky at all times. These satellites are this orbital regime is used for satellite communications and missile warning predominantly. And then the fourth orbit is a highly elliptical Earth orbit. These are satellites that have that go out to about 35,000 kilometers and beyond, then go out to about 42,000 kilometers. But what the real benefit is that they are highly inclined, which means that they fly over the North Pole, and so it gives us polar coverage for their Space Force missions. If you're only in geosynchronous Earth orbit, you have a hard time seeing north of 70 degrees and south of 70 degrees. And so these highly elliptical Earth orbit give you coverage of the poles for those same Space Force missions. So across these orbits, we do satellite communications, space domain awareness, missile warning, weather data, and the mission largely drives the orbit where we place it. So where the Space Force is going, this gets into the priorities for the Space Force and what you're going to see in things like budget submissions and key initiatives going forward. So the first line of effort is to field combat-ready forces. By that we mean fielding capabilities that can be presented to a combatant commander to accomplish their mission. So the first part of that is resilient space architectures. For 30 years, under Air Force Space Command, the Air Force built the most capable constellation of satellites that were very cost-effective and very exquisite. They did their job, and they did it very, very well. As the threat has become more of an operational concern, we still have to maintain that same level of capability, but we have to do so in a way that is resilient to attacks by our adversaries. And so that's the idea behind these resilient space architectures. Instead of fielding a small number of exquisite satellites, we want to field a large number of resilient satellites, and so that destroying any single satellite doesn't have a meaningful operational impact on the user. The second part of fielding combat-ready forces is developing the operational test and training infrastructure that will allow us to prepare guardians and the concepts and the tactics to fight through the types of attacks that we anticipate our rivals will be able to field in the coming years. That is training simulators, that is large force exercises, that is having the ability to do modeling in sim so you can anticipate the threat, plan against the threat, train against the threat, and then field forces that are prepared to meet that threat in an operational environment. And then the last part of fielding combat-ready forces is not just the forces themselves, but how we sustain those forces so that they can conduct prompt and sustained activities for a combatant command. Sustainment for the Air Force looks like maintenance and logistics and supply chains. Sustainment for the Space Force is a lot of software updates and equipment updates around the world. And so the Space Force is experimenting with different command structures that bring sustainment and force generation and mission activities under a single commander. And that's the idea of an integrated mission delta. The Space Force recently activated 2 provisional integrated mission deltas. These are prototype beta units where we are learning how this command structure can be used to bring operations and sustainment under a single commander, so that sustainment is informed by operations and operations is informed by sustainment. That's an ongoing beta. We did one for the PNT mission, and then we did one for the EW mission, electromagnetic warfare mission. Additional ones will follow as we learn what works and what doesn't. The second line of Air Force that the Space Force has is to amplify the Guardian spirit. You know, we talk about Guardians. These are the people within the Space Force. Guardian spirit is the collective set of traits and mentality that makes someone successful within the Space Force. 2 priorities that we have under this. The first one is the Personnel Management Act. This is the Space Force's #1 legislative priority. And what it would do is create a single service component that combines the full-time mission with the part-time reserve missions that are today are in the Air Force Reserve. And so today there are people in the Air Force Reserve that provide critical support to Space Force missions. The idea behind the Personnel Management Act is to create a single service where those Air Force reservists become guardians within the Space Force. They're just part-time guardians. And what this does is it allows a guardian to move back and forth between a full-time and a part-time capacity. That proposal is still working its way through Congress, but it's been the #1 priority. And the Space Force is continuing to answer questions related to that and how it would be implemented. And then the comprehensive fitness assessment. Today, Guardians can enroll in a 2-year study where instead of taking an annual PT test, they are continuously monitored through a watch. I have mine on right now. That records when they exercise, how much they exercise. And as long as you're doing that and maintaining continuous fitness, you don't have to take that reoccurring PT test. The idea behind the comprehensive fitness assessment is instead of making fitness something you do once or twice a year for your test, it's a continuous part of your life cycle that's continuously monitored to maintain a healthy force. And then the third line of effort is partner to win. You know, the Space Force was uniquely designed to be reliant on partners. So we don't have all the mission support capabilities that we need in the Space Force. We rely on the Air Force to provide things like civil engineering and contracting support and finance support, logistics, security forces. And so the Air Force is and will always be our most important partner as they provide those critical mission support services at the Space Force bases. But the Space Force is also designed where the preponderance of our forces are presented to a single combatant command. So that makes U.S. Space Command an important partner, as well as our forces are presented to U.S. Space Command to do that combatant command mission. And then we partner with industry on a daily basis to make sure that the most current and capable technology makes it into the hands of Guardians, and then our international partners as well. And then through that, you know, when the Space Force was established, initially all of the Space Force capabilities were presented to a single combatant commander. But space is critical to every combatant command in every area of responsibility in every domain. And so I talked a little bit about the component field commands. That is the Space Force attempt to partner with all the combatant commands to make sure that they have access to the Guardians and the expertise and the forces that they need to do the day-to-day Space Force mission. All right. And then my last slide before we get to questions has to do with the budget. And as you can see there, the budget has grown every year since the Space Force was established, from about $15 billion in fiscal year 21 to $26 billion in FY 23. And so as chapter members, should you have to defend that budget, right, there's really three ways that we defend that budget, and they're all equally important. The first is, yes, that's a lot of money, but the Space Force does an important mission, and that mission is going to continue to grow. The second reason that budget is growing is that as you establish the Space Force and you take space capabilities in the Army and the Navy and you transfer them to the Space Force, that transfer is going to come with money as well. So it's an important mission that's growing. And then the transfer of space missions to the Space Force from the other services, that also brings more budget requirements. And then the third one is that the other services are looking at missions that are today done in the air, land, or maritime domains that can be migrated to space, right? And so that's the third area where the Space Force budget has grown over the last couple of years. The best example of this is ground moving target indicators. That's the JSTAR mission that is being migrated to space so that it is more global, more responsive, and more defendable than the aging JSTARS fleet. That's a new mission migrating into the space domain, and it's another source of budget growth within the Space Force. So that wraps up the brief itself at about 36 minutes, right between 30 and 40 minutes. And so now I want to turn it over to Q&A. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer them. I have another question. How does the projected growth in U.S. Space Force compare to projected growth in China's Space Force? Yeah, so this is where, when we talk about the pacing threat for the DoD, it is China. And China is growing their space capabilities at a rate that accelerates every year. And they're really growing their Space Force. It's primarily focused on, so they have a strategic support force. They don't call it a Space Force, it's a strategic support force, but it includes both their missile forces and their overhead ISR capabilities as well. And those forces are focused on targeting the joint force with intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance from space. And so their number of satellites is growing very quickly, and the Space Force is having to grow to stay ahead of that threat so that we can continue to protect the joint force from that space-enabled attack. So I have a question from John Diamond. How did Sputnik affect the timeline? Right, so Sputnik was the first satellite placed in orbit around Earth. It was launched by the Soviet Union, and it really had two impacts on the timeline for U.S. military operations. The first was that it demonstrated that the Soviets had the ability to launch a missile anywhere in the Earth. Because if you have a missile that can put something in orbit around the Earth, you have a missile that can get anywhere in Earth. So it forced the United States to accelerate the development of its own rockets, but then it also forced the U.S. to accelerate the development of its own satellites. And the launch of Sputnik provided a precedent for unrestricted overflight. And so it allowed the U.S. to launch their own satellites over the Soviet Union using the same precedents of unrestricted overflight that Sputnik established. Let's see, a lot of good questions. How does the Space Force plan to rely on commercial launch capabilities such as SpaceX for ongoing operations? Yeah, this is something that the Air Force figured out a while ago and that the Space Force is building upon. The way that the Space Force does launch today is launch as a service. And so both SpaceX and ULA provide launch services to the Space Force, contracted through SSC, and then launched out of ranges that are controlled by the Space Force. So the Space Force provides the range, and then SpaceX and ULA and eventually other launch providers provide that launch as a service from the two ranges, one at Vandenberg and then the other one at Cape Canaveral. Another question, please discuss the migration of Army, Navy, Marine Corps resources into the Space Force. So one of the reasons that the Space Force was established was to consolidate space missions from all services into a single service, single military department. And so from the Navy operated MUOS, mobile user object satellite system. It's a communication satellite for tactical users. That capability transferred to the Space Force and is now operated by TENSOPS out of Point Mugu in Southern California. For the Army, what transferred was the payload operations for wideband satellite communication. And so that would be the 53rd Space Operations Squadron. And then the JTAG system, which is Joint Tactical Ground System, Alert Ground System, which is the ability to provide missile warning in theater. And so those two missions have transferred to the Space Force and are now Space Force missions. But with it came a large number of formerly soldiers and sailors to help the Space Force operate those missions. They're now Guardians. They wear blue name tape. But those are the main missions that transferred. We have another question. Can you discuss the Space Force's weather mission and status of modernizing the program for environmental monitoring? I can discuss the weather mission a little bit. I'm not as familiar on modernization efforts. The weather mission is a shared mission with NOAA. The Space Force contribution to that mission is run out of Dahlgren, 19th Space Defense Squadron, and then they have a detachment that flies those satellites. And that's the extent of my knowledge on that one. Will Space Force ever pick up support AFSCs such as security forces, etc.? Right now, that is not the plan. We get all the support we need from the Air Force for those missions. Where there is an opportunity to grow, that would be with civilians who come over and augment those missions. But right now, we rely on the Air Force for those mission support activities. We have a question from Walter Kula. You indicated in your briefing that the Space Force budget has grown a lot, but you still need more advocacy. How much more funding do you anticipate will be needed? I can't speak to specific amounts, but what I will say is as new missions migrate from air, land, and maritime domains to the Space Force, that'll require more budget to do those missions as well. So as the missions of the Space Force grow, it'll require both more people and then the resources to make those missions possible. But in terms of a specific number, I couldn't say. So it looks like that's all the questions. Again, I want to thank the AFA chapters for their time and their advocacy out in the local communities. If there's any additional questions, you can get questions to me through AFA and the team here. But thank you for your time and all you do for the Space Force.